rather than the leader.
Richard, how would you think about, in your role, how do you think about leadership?
Yeah, thanks, Doctor. First of all, just an observation about where we are in our country. Where we are in the world, first of all, we are at a critical inflection point for global development where I think this audience would understand that more people have been lifted out of global poverty in the last, or extreme poverty in the last 25 years than at any time in human history. And with the MDGs behind us and the SDGs ahead of us, we literally have an opportunity to, put our man on the moon, if you will, to eliminate the most extreme poverty on the planet by the year 2030. So critical inflection point where leadership is critically needed in the world and in our country. And we've all heard the expression, leadership abhors a vacuum. Well, for many decades, the United States has held a critical leadership position in the world, a moral vision of a better, safer world that, although imperfect, the United States is not a perfect player or actor by any means, but we were the de facto leader of the world with a moral vision of freedom and democracy and human rights and opportunity, economic opportunity for all. And with the current nativism and inward turning of our country, we've abdicated that leadership role in many ways in the world. And if leadership abhors a vacuum, who rushes in to fill that vacuum? Well, other actors rush in. Russia, China, extremist groups in various parts of the world rush in to fill that vacuum. And so right now we're at a critical place where we need that moral vision for what the world can be and should be. How can we shape the world, globalized world, in the next several decades? So that's kind of the backdrop to my comments. But in terms of leadership at World Vision, as you said, we're a faith-based organization, and one of the opportunities we have is you kind of have to know your swim lanes, right? So we have a fair amount of influence in the faith community in the United States and faith communities around the world as well. What we've been doing in the past few years is really trying to use our voice with church leaders in the United States, in particular religious leaders, to try to move them toward activism, if you will, around issues of global poverty, global security, speaking out on refugees, speaking out on foreign assistance, those kinds of things. The Trump administration in particular listens to evangelicals. And what we're trying to show the administration is that evangelicals care about immigration. They care about global poverty. They care about global development, global health issues, and refugees. And so we're trying to mobilize those faith-based voices in the United States to move members of Congress and to move the administration to stand strong on some of the things that we've worked on so hard over the last few decades. And foreign assistance is a good example. I published an op-ed with the head of Catholic Relief Services in the Washington Post earlier this year that basically said a conservative Christian's reason for supporting foreign assistance. And so we've tried to let members of Congress know, especially Republican members of Congress, that there is a strong constituency in the United States that supports strong foreign assistance programs that make for a better, safer world. So that's an example of how we're trying to use our leadership platform to influence policy right now in the U.S.
So, quick story, 4 years ago, my first day on the job at Starbucks happened to coincide with sort of a monumental government shutdown. And as it was my first day, I was doing what most people do on their first day. I was standing in the coffee line ordering coffee, and I didn't know anybody, and I was standing there, and suddenly somebody pokes me on the shoulder and kind of pulls me out of the coffee line. And it's Howard Schultz, our then CEO. I'm like, oh, okay. And everyone's kind of getting nervous, like he's getting pulled out of the line by Howard. And so Howard looked at me and was like, well, can you believe this government shutdown? What do you think about that? And I said, well, it's appalling. It's embarrassing. I used to work in Washington, D.C. It's a failure of government. It's a failure of partisanship. It's an embarrassment for the country. And he says, like, yeah, I know. What are we going to do about it? I was like, we could send them coffee. We were Starbucks. We're in Seattle. And then I'll never forget this. He looks at me and he pokes me in the chest and he says, "What are you going to do about it?" And he walks away. And I text my wife, I'm like, "It is on." And like, that forever changed my expectation of what corporate leadership meant. Because he was not kidding. He went, "We're going to lead. We're going to do something about this." And for the one reason is that our 370,000 young people in 75 countries at 27,000 locations expect their company to stand just like you all do. They want to be a part of something bigger. And that's kind of hard to imagine in sort of our industry. But that is the differentiated experience that we hope to provide our partners. That's what we call them. And so corporate leadership for us is about exceeding their expectations, about standing for something bigger. And yes, we actually put petitions in every one of our 14,000 stores for 3 days, asking people to sign it. We've never done anything like that. We counted them. We sent them all back. We walked them up the Capitol steps and to the White House, and we simply asked the government to reopen. And by coincidence, not probably because of us, they did. And we felt pretty good about that. But it was largely symbolic. But for our partners, it was an example of the kind of leadership that I think Starbucks has had for almost 40 years. And a reminder to me that when it comes to leadership, corporations can and could do a lot more.
If I might add something to my answer to tie in the global theme, which I think is really important, and that's that when we try and urge our students to think of themselves as leaders, we do want that to be, we want all our students to think of themselves as global citizens and therefore as global leaders. We take very seriously our public mission. In many ways, I think of us as the university for Washington rather than just of Washington. But if we want to do the very best in touching all the corners of Washington and making this a better place, it requires that global vision and that global leadership. We're one of the most trade-dependent states in the country. If you are a young person who was born in Prosser, Washington, or in the Tri-Cities, and let's say you're never going to have your main home more than 200 or 300 miles away from where you were born. If you work at Starbucks, if you work at Microsoft, if you work at Amazon, if you work at one of the many NGOs that are doing work on international development, you're going to, first of all, be working with a global workforce. You're going to be working together side by side with people from all over the world. You're probably going to be spending time abroad representing your company, et cetera. So those skills, that vision that's involved in being a global citizen and leadership is crucial to being a citizen of this state. And at times, as probably you know, there's that kind of tension of, well, Washington versus global. And it's a false dichotomy. If you want to do the right thing for Washington, you've got to think globally.
So, thank you very much for that clarification. Richard kind of pointed out some very interesting points, and John's story is fantastic. Because he does talk about voice, but Richard also, in some ways talked about using the voice and the current climate that we are in. And this is actually kind of interesting because, as a prelude to the conference, I kind of posted a couple of blogs around where I felt, where we are kind of struggling today. That we've got these crises that are happening, the Rohingya crisis being one of them. And there is this tepidness in terms of how we think about our response. And as a state and as a community of internationalists, what is our role in terms of the voice that we give? And how do we give that voice that is not necessarily, using Anna Marie's throwing a bomb, but really to try and bring and stitch the community together so that you can effectively understand how we can take on moral leadership. So, one of you want to talk about, how are you doing it from your institution in terms of giving voice to those that may not necessarily have voice? And then talking about the issue which might be uncomfortable, like Howard Schultz did, and says, hey, what are we going to do about this as an individual and then as a company?
Maybe I could start with that one. I said earlier in our pre-meeting that you take the refugees, for example, the Syrian refugees. If you haven't met a Syrian refugee, if you haven't heard their story and sat in their tent, it's very hard to relate, living in the middle of the United States, whether it's in Seattle or Kansas or wherever you live, it's very hard to relate to the humanity of their story. And I've been at World Vision now 20 years, and I find that what I do year after year after year is I try to communicate to our donors and our constituencies the humanity of the other people around the world that seem very different from us. They're different racially, ethnically, different language groups, different religions, but the humanity of these people. And every time I speak publicly, my wife will give me the elbow, tell more stories, stop it with the statistics, people want to hear stories. And she's right, because when you get a hardened conservative American who wants to ban refugees, when you get them to meet a refugee family, it all changes. It all changes when they hear their story. I was in Lebanon last month and met with a refugee family. The father and 3 of his older sons were working in their machine shop, and